Have you ever wondered what happened when an emperor committed a crime in ancient times? I mean, who judges the judge? Who punishes the punisher? Imagine you are an emperor who just got caught stealing your neighbor's prized golden peacock. Now, in normal circumstances, theft would cost you a hand or two. But you're the emperor, you make the laws. So, what happens next? Well, buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make modern court dramas look like child's play. Fun fact: in ancient China, there is actually a special court system just for trying imperial family members. And let me tell you, some of these cases were absolutely wild. We're talking about emperors being put on trial for everything from petty theft to attempted murder by their own mothers. But before we dive into these juicy historical scandals, let me warn you, what you're about to learn might seriously change how you view ancient imperial justice systems forever. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why some historians call this the most sophisticated legal system of the ancient world. Part 1. The Imperial Justice System. Now, let's travel back to ancient China during the Tang Dynasty, around 650 CE. The imperial court had just witnessed something unprecedented. Emperor Gaozong was about to be put on trial. The charge: abuse of power and corruption. The prosecutor: his own grandmother, Grand Empress Dowager Wang. You see, in ancient China, there existed a fascinating concept called heaven's mandate. This basically meant that an emperor's right to rule came directly from heaven. But here's the kicker: this mandate could be revoked if the emperor failed to maintain moral standards. And who better to judge an emperor's morality than their own family? The imperial court system was structured like a pyramid, but inverted when it came to the royal family. The higher your status, the more scrutiny you faced. Regular citizens will be tried in local courts, nobles in specialized tribunals, but members of the imperial family, they faced the dreaded Court of Imperial Clan Affairs, or Zhongjingxi. This court was unique because it operated independently from the emperor's direct control. Its judges were selected from a pool of retired officials known for their impeccable moral character. And get this, they were immune from imperial prosecution while serving. Talk about job security. But what made this system truly remarkable was its emphasis on public accountability. Every trial involving an imperial family member was recorded in detail and made available for future generations to study. These records were considered so important that they were stored in multiple locations to prevent any convenient losses or alterations. Let me paint you a picture of how these trials worked. Imagine you're in the Grand Hall of Supreme Harmony. The accused imperial family member would enter from the East Gate, dressed not in their usual magnificent robes, but in simple white garments, the color of humility and submission. The judges would sit facing south, symbolizing their temporary authority over even the emperor himself. The prosecution would present their case using a fascinating system of colored tablets: red for serious crimes, yellow for moderate offenses, and white for minor infractions. But here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike regular courts where punishment was often swift and severe, the imperial court had to balance justice with maintaining the dignity of the royal family. They developed what historians now call the three delays system: investigation, deliberation, and execution of sentence. During these delays, the accused would be confined to their palace quarters. Though calling it confinement might be a stretch, considering these prison cells were more luxurious than most people's homes. They were allowed to maintain their usual lifestyle, but were forbidden from participating in any official duties or ceremonies. The punishments themselves, oh boy, they were something else. While common criminals might face physical punishment, members of the imperial family were subject to what we might call status execution. They could be stripped of their titles, removed from the imperial genealogy, or in extreme cases, forced to become common citizens. And if you think that doesn't sound too bad, remember, in a society where your entire identity was built around your position in the imperial hierarchy, being reduced to commoner status was often considered worse than death. Speaking of death, here's a twisted little detail that perfectly captures the complexity of this system. If an imperial family member was sentenced to death, which was rare but possible, they were given a special silk rope. The material was chosen not for comfort, mind you, but because it was considered improper for common hemp to touch royal skin even in death. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this system was its psychological impact on the imperial family. Just knowing that such a court existed created a unique form of self-regulation among royal family members. After all, who wants to be remembered in the imperial records as the prince who got caught stealing chickens from the palace kitchen? Yes, that actually happened, but we'll get to that story in part 2. What happened to Emperor Gaozong in his trial? And what about that chicken-stealing prince? Well, those stories, along with the absolutely mind-blowing tale of the empress who tried herself in her own court, coming up next. Trust me, you won't want to miss these historical plot twists that make modern reality TV look tame in comparison. Part 2, Imperial Scandals and Justice. Glad you are still with me. Now, where were we? Yes, Emperor Gaozong's trial and that chicken-stealing prince I promised to tell you about. But first, let me share something that will blow your mind. Did you know that some imperial trials lasted longer than most modern TV series? We're talking years of drama, intrigue, and plot twists that would make George R.R. Martin jealous. Remember Emperor Gaozong? When his grandmother accused him of corruption, the entire imperial court held its breath. The charge was serious. He had allegedly been accepting bribes in exchange for political appointments. But here's the twist. During the trial, evidence emerged that the bribes weren't going to him at all, but to his favorite concubine, Lady Wu, who would later become the infamous Empress Wu Zetian. The trial lasted for 3 months, during which Gaozong was required to attend daily sessions wearing plain robes. The sight of an emperor being questioned like a common criminal was so unprecedented that court artists created multiple scrolls depicting the scene, some of which still exist today. But the real drama came when Lady Wu herself took the stand. In a move that would have made any modern lawyer proud, she turned the tables by presenting evidence that the bribes were actually traditional gifts given during the Lunar New Year, a common practice that had been documented in court records for centuries. The case was eventually dismissed, but not before setting a precedent that would change imperial law forever. From that point on, all gifts to the imperial family had to be officially recorded and their value assessed by independent officials. Now, about that chicken-stealing Prince Zhu Yujian of the Ming Dynasty. In 1615, at the age of 13, he was caught stealing chickens from the imperial kitchen. But here's the kicker, he wasn't stealing them to eat them. He was taking them to feed a group of hungry street children he had befriended through a hole in the palace wall. When brought before the imperial clan court, young Zhu defended his actions with a quote from Confucius: "The gentleman cannot feast while others starved." The judges were so impressed by his moral reasoning that instead of punishment, they recommended a review of the imperial kitchen's food distribution policies. This case actually led to the establishment of the Imperial Surplus Distribution Edict, which required palace kitchens throughout China to distribute excess food to the poor, a practice that continued for over 3 centuries. But not all cases had such positive outcomes. Take the case of Prince Yong of the Qing dynasty. In 1726, he was caught running an illegal gambling operation from his palace quarters. Now, gambling wasn't technically illegal for the imperial family, but using loaded dice? That was a different story entirely. The trial revealed an elaborate scheme involving marked cards, weighted dice, and a network of servants who acted as lookouts. The prince had apparently won enough money to buy a small province, which, ironically, he would have inherited anyway as an imperial prince. His punishment? The court sentenced him to what they called the 3 removals: removal from the imperial residence, removal from the imperial allowance system, and removal from the imperial genealogy. He was essentially erased from royal history, though obviously not completely since we're talking about him now. But perhaps the most fascinating case was that of Empress Wang of the Han Dynasty, who actually put herself on trial. In 70 BCE, after a series of natural disasters, which are considered signs of heaven's displeasure, she voluntarily submitted herself to the imperial clan court for investigation. The charge: failing to maintain proper moral standards as the empire's first lady. During the trial, she sat in the defendant's position while continuing to wear her empress regalia, creating a peculiar situation where she was simultaneously the highest and lowest ranked person in the room. The court was so confused about how to proceed that they had to invent new protocols on the spot. They ended up creating the self-examination rites, which became a regular part of imperial governance. Once every 3 years, members of the imperial family were required to submit themselves for moral review. This system became so influential that it spread beyond China. The Korean Joseon dynasty adopted a similar practice, though they added their own twist. The royal family members had to write public self-criticism essays that were then distributed throughout the kingdom. But if you think these cases are wild, wait until you hear about the time an entire imperial court went on trial. Yes, you heard that right. The judges themselves were put in the defendant's box. And the reason why? Well, that's a story that involves a missing emperor, a mysterious letter, and the most expensive bowl of noodles in Chinese history. Part 3. The Trial of the Century. Imagine being so powerful that you could try anyone in your empire for any crime, except when you're the one being tried for eating noodles. Yes, you heard that right, noodles. But not just any noodles. These were the legendary Dragon's Whiskers noodles, and they caused what historians now call the Great Imperial Court Crisis of 1728. Let me set the scene. Emperor Yongjing of the Qing dynasty had mysteriously disappeared for 3 days. The entire court was in an uproar. Search parties were dispatched, and prayers were being offered in every temple across Beijing. Where was he? In a noodle shop in the southern part of the city, disguised as a merchant, because he had heard rumors about a chef who made noodles so fine they looked like strands of dragon's beard candy. Now, this might not seem like a big deal to us today, but there was one tiny problem. Imperial law strictly forbade the emperor from leaving the Forbidden City without proper ceremony and escort. The punishment? The entire court will be held responsible for failing to prevent such a breach of protocol. So when Emperor Yongjing finally returned, still slurping the last of his noodles, he found himself facing not just any trial, but a trial of the entire imperial justice system itself. The head of the imperial clan court, a stern old man named Wei Zhongxian, had to figure out how to try an emperor for breaking imperial law while simultaneously being tried himself for allowing the emperor to break said law. If that sounds confusing, imagine how they felt. The trial proceedings were absolutely bizarre. The judges had to simultaneously act as defendants and arbitrators. They would stand up to make accusations, then sit down to defend themselves, then stand again to judge their own defense. One particularly amusing moment occurred when Judge Wei had to interrupt his own testimony to object to it, leading to the famous quote, "I find myself suspicious of my own argument, but I must admit I make a compelling case against myself." The situation got even more complicated when the noodle chef was called as a witness. According to court records, he was so nervous about testifying that he fainted 3 times during his testimony. Each time he was revived with smelling salts, he would continue his story exactly where he left off, but with increasingly elaborate details about how these were the best noodles in all of China. The emperor, for his part, didn't help matters by insisting that the quality of the noodles should be entered into evidence. This led to the bizarre spectacle of imperial food tasters having to sample noodles in the middle of court proceedings to verify their exceptional nature. But here's where it gets really interesting. The court had to invent an entirely new legal framework just to handle this case. They called it the Mutual Responsibility Doctrine, which essentially stated that when everyone in the power structure is guilty, the punishment must be distributed proportionally according to rank. The final verdict? Everyone was found guilty: the emperor, the judges, the guards, even the noodle chef. But the punishments were uniquely fitting to the crime. The emperor had to host a public feast where he shared the famous noodles with common citizens. The judges had to write detailed treatises on the balance between imperial privilege and responsibility. The guards were assigned to taste test all food entering the palace. Not really a punishment, if you ask me. As for the noodle chef, he was sentenced to become the imperial court's official noodle maker, complete with a generous salary and his own kitchen in the Forbidden City. Talk about failing upward. This case actually led to significant reforms in imperial law. The Dragon's Whiskers protocols, as they came to be known, established clear guidelines for handling cases where traditional power structures were thrown into chaos by unexpected imperial behavior. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the establishment of the imperial incognito rights, a set of carefully defined circumstances under which an emperor could move among common people without facing legal consequences. These rights came with strict conditions, including the requirement to taste and report back on any exceptionally good food discovered during these excursions. You know, there's something profound about a legal system that could evolve to handle even its own highest authorities breaking its rules. It shows that even in ancient times, people understood that true justice had to apply to everyone, even if you had to tie yourself in legal knots to make it work. And as for those noodles, the recipe was preserved in the imperial archives, protected as a state secret for centuries. Some say you can still find descendants of that original noodle chef making their famous Dragon's Whiskers in Beijing today, though they'll never admit it if you ask them. Part 4. The Empty Throne Tribunal. What's worse than being tried for your crimes? Being tried after you're dead. Welcome to the most bizarre trial in imperial history, the posthumous prosecution of Emperor Wang Mang of the Xian dynasty. The year was 23 CE, and the Han dynasty had just overthrown the Xian dynasty. There was just one small problem. How do you prosecute a dead emperor for crimes against the state? Especially when that emperor had technically been the state. The solution they came up with was absolutely wild. They created what became known as the Empty Throne Tribunal, literally a trial where the defendant's throne sat empty in the courtroom, draped in black silk. The charges against the deceased Emperor Wang Mang were extensive: usurpation, corruption, and my personal favorite, excessive innovation in currency design. Yes, you heard that right. He was posthumously charged with creating too many new types of coins. The prosecutors actually had to address their arguments to the empty throne, maintaining full ceremonial protocol as if the dead emperor were present. They would bow to the empty seat before presenting evidence, and court scribes had to record reactions from the throne, usually noted as the accused maintains imperial silence. But here's where it gets really interesting. The court appointed a spirit advocate, a legal representative who would channel the dead emperor's responses through divination. This poor official had to throw divine lots before answering each accusation, leading to some rather unpredictable defense strategies. During one particularly tense moment, the spirit advocate threw the lots and had to announce that the deceased emperor was laughing uncontrollably at a particularly serious charge. The court had to take a recess to consult ancient texts about how to handle contempt of court charges against a spirit. The trial lasted for 49 days, the traditional length of imperial mourning, and involved over 300 witnesses, including several other dead people who were represented by their descendants. One of the most fascinating aspects was the handling of material evidence. Since they couldn't exactly bring the defendant to court, they brought his policies instead. Actual clay tablets containing his edicts were placed on trial, with some being ceremonially broken when found guilty. The court even put his reform policies on trial separately from his personal actions. This led to the bizarre situation where some of Wang Mang's economic reforms were found not guilty, even as the man himself was condemned. But the most incredible part, the punishment phase. How do you punish someone who's already dead? The court came up with something unprecedented: historical revision with legal backing. They created the Eternal Shame Decree, a legal document that required all future histories to refer to Wang Mang by his personal name rather than his imperial title, effectively posthumously demoting him from emperor to commoner. They also ordered his tomb to be reoriented to face north instead of south, the traditional imperial direction, creating what historians now call reverse feng shui punishment, possibly the only case in history where architecture was used as a legal penalty. The influence of this trial was enormous. It established the principle that even death couldn't protect an emperor from justice, leading to the creation of the eternal accountability laws that govern imperial behavior for centuries to come. These laws stated that an emperor's actions could be judged up to 3 generations after their death, creating what might be the longest statute of limitations in legal history. Imagine knowing that your great-grandchildren might have to defend your decisions in court. You know what's really fascinating about this? The Empty Throne Tribunal wasn't just about punishing a dead emperor, it was about establishing the principle that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, was always answerable to justice, even if that justice had to wait until after you were dead. Think about it, they created an entire legal framework just to try someone who wasn't even alive to defend himself. And why? Because they believed that accountability shouldn't end with death, especially for those who held the highest power. Part 5: The Mirror Court. What happens when an emperor has to judge himself? No, literally judge himself, using an actual mirror? Welcome to the strangest court proceeding in imperial history, the mirror trial of Emperor Qianlong. The year was 1735, and Emperor Qianlong had just ascended to the throne. According to ancient tradition, every new emperor had to undergo what was called the mirror judgment, a ritual that turned into one of history's most peculiar legal proceedings. Picture this: a massive bronze mirror, taller than a man, positioned in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The emperor had to stand before it, wearing simple white robes, and conduct a trial against his own reflection. The logic behind this was fascinating. Traditional Chinese philosophy held that a mirror didn't just reflect your appearance, it reflected your true nature. Therefore, who better to judge an emperor than his own unvarnished truth? But Qianlong took this ritual to an entirely new level. Instead of the usual one-day ceremony, he extended it to 7 days. Each day, he would interrogate his reflection about a different aspect of imperial responsibility. Court records show that he actually got into heated arguments with himself. On day 3, he reportedly spent 6 hours debating with his reflection about the morality of imperial taxation. The scribes had the unenviable task of recording both sides of this one-person argument. Here's where it gets really interesting. During the trial, Qianlong established the dialogue protocol, a set of rules for how an emperor should question himself. These included gems like the reflection must be allowed to complete its thought before the emperor can respond, and no attempting to dodge difficult questions by moving out of the mirror's view. The most dramatic moment came on day 5 when Qianlong accused his reflection of harboring thoughts of luxury at the expense of the common people. The reflection, according to the emperor's own testimony, responded by refusing to mirror his movements for a full hour, an event that sent the entire court into an absolute panic. This led to the creation of the mirror strike precedent, the only time in legal history where a reflective surface was recorded as exercising civil disobedience. But the real genius of the mirror court was its psychological impact. Qianlong had to maintain 2 distinct legal personalities, prosecutor and defendant, while physically confronting his own image. It was like a medieval version of psychotherapy, but with legal consequences. The punishments he imposed on himself were equally fascinating. For instance, when his reflection convicted him of potential arrogance, he sentenced himself to eat with wooden chopsticks instead of golden ones for a year. He also required himself to spend 1 day each month wearing the clothes of a common scholar. The mirror court system actually spread beyond China. In Korea, they adapted it into the pool court, where kings would judge their reflection in a still pool of black ink. Japan developed the shadow tribunal, where emperors would judge their shadow cast by candlelight. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the establishment of what scholars now call reflective justice, the principle that rulers should regularly confront and judge their own actions before judging others. You know what's remarkable about this? In creating this seemingly theatrical form of self-judgment, they actually invented one of the world's first systems of institutionalized self-reflection for political leaders. In the mirror? That original bronze mirror still exists today, kept in the Forbidden City. They say if you stand before it at the right time of day, you can still see the worn spot where generations of emperors stood to judge themselves. Part 6. The Animal Court and the Jade Parrot Conspiracy. Ever heard of a parrot being put on trial for treason? No? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the most unusual court case in imperial history. The trial of the Jade Parrot. The year was 1751, and Emperor Qianlong, yes, our mirror-gazing friend, had a beloved pet parrot. This wasn't just any parrot, it was an imperial green parrot that lived in a jade cage and had been taught to recite classical poetry. The problem? This particular bird had also learned to mimic the emperor's voice perfectly, and someone in the court had apparently taught it to issue imperial orders. When court officials discovered that several minor edicts had been issued by a bird impersonating the emperor, they faced an unprecedented legal dilemma. How do you prosecute a parrot for impersonating the Son of Heaven? Thus was born the Animal Court, a special tribunal created specifically to try animals that had influenced imperial decisions. The first case? The Imperial Court versus one green parrot, known as the Jade Voice. The trial proceedings were absolutely fascinating. The parrot had its own defender, a junior official who had to interpret the bird's squawks as legal arguments. The prosecution brought in expert witnesses, including bird trainers who testified about a parrot's capacity for malicious intent. But the real drama came when they tried to enter the parrot's mimicry as evidence. Every time the bird was brought into court, it would perfectly imitate the emperor saying "case dismissed," causing absolute chaos among the scribes who weren't sure whether to obey or ignore it. The court had to create special protocols just for this case. They established the beast speech doctrine, which determined when animal noises could be considered legally binding imperial commands. They actually had to write a law specifying that imperial orders were only valid if issued by the actual emperor, not just something that sounded like him. The investigation revealed an elaborate conspiracy. Certain court officials had been using the parrot to issue minor edicts after hours, creating a whole shadow government run by a bird in a jade cage. The trial lasted for 3 months, during which the parrot had to be kept in a special soundproof cage to prevent it from disrupting proceedings with false imperial commands. The cage itself became evidence and had to be logged as Exhibit of one jade cage, instrument of deception. But here's where it gets really wild. The court had to determine whether a parrot could form criminal intent. They brought in Buddhist monks to testify about animal consciousness, Confucian scholars to discuss moral responsibility, and even a parrot feng shui expert. Yes, that was apparently a real profession. The final verdict? The parrot was found guilty, but not criminally responsible, due to avian nature. Its punishment? Exile to a remote monastery, where it would be retrained to recite only Buddhist sutras. But the conspiracy didn't end there. The investigation spawned a whole series of animal trials. There was the case of the emperor's pet cricket that had been trained to chirp auspiciously during important ceremonies, the palace cats accused of influencing imperial decisions by purring at strategic moments, and even a goldfish that allegedly used its swimming patterns to manipulate the imperial feng shui. These cases led to the creation of the imperial bestiary laws, possibly the world's first comprehensive legal framework for dealing with politically influential animals. The laws included such specific provisions as no bird shall be taught to mimic imperial commands, and fish movements shall not be considered as divinatory signs without proper certification. You know what's fascinating about this? In trying to solve the ridiculous problem of a parrot impersonating the emperor, they actually created one of history's most sophisticated frameworks for determining the relationship between human authority and animal influence. And as for the jade parrot, legend has it that at the monastery, it gave up imperial impersonations and became quite good at chanting sutras. Some say on quiet nights, you can still hear a distinctly imperial-sounding voice reciting Buddhist prayers among the temple bells. Part 7. The Season Courts. What if I told you that stealing a peach in summer was considered a worse crime than stealing an entire orchard in winter? Welcome to the Season Courts of Imperial China, where justice changed with the weather. The Season Courts emerged during the Song Dynasty, based on the ancient Chinese belief that human behavior was influenced by natural cycles. Each season had its own court, with different judges, different laws, and wildly different punishments. Summer crimes were judged most harshly. Why? Because according to imperial philosophy, summer represented the height of yang energy, when people should be at their most rational and controlled. The summer court was decorated entirely in red, and judges wore special heat-resistant caps made of bamboo to symbolize their ability to think coolly even in scorching temperatures. In one famous case, Prince Zhaoheng was caught stealing a single peach from the imperial gardens in midsummer. His defense: the peach looked too perfect not to eat. In winter, this might have earned him a light scolding. But in summer, he was sentenced to spend a month studying agricultural texts, and then personally plant 10 to 100 peach trees. Winter crimes, by contrast, were judged more leniently. The winter court operated on the principle that energy made people more susceptible to improper impulses. The court chamber was decorated in black and white, and proceedings were conducted by candlelight, even during daytime. Spring and autumn courts were considered transitional courts, where the same crime might receive completely different punishments depending on which way the seasonal energy was flowing. Spring favored rehabilitation, while autumn focused on restitution. The most fascinating aspect was the cross-seasonal appeal system. If you were tried in one season, you could appeal to have your case heard in another. This led to some defendants deliberately delaying their trials until a more favorable season. One clever prince, accused of misappropriating imperial funds, managed to delay his summer court trial for 3 months. By the time he was tried in autumn, his crime was reinterpreted as innovative resource allocation, and he was actually commended for his creativity. The system created the Seasonal Precedent Catalog, a complex legal document that tracked how the same crimes were punished in different seasons. Court astronomers had to be present at all trials to confirm the exact position of celestial bodies, which could influence sentencing. Some crimes were considered season-specific. Taking a nap during an imperial ceremony was a capital offense in summer, when one should be most energetic, but barely warranted a warning in winter. Wearing the wrong color robe was a serious crime in spring, but considered an understandable mistake in autumn. Perhaps the most bizarre case was the trial of Eternal Spring, where a prince accused of a serious summer crime tried to argue that since his personal garden was artificially maintained at spring temperatures year-round, he should be tried under spring laws. This led to the creation of the Natural Order Statute, which specified that justice must follow the seasons of heaven, not the artificial seasons of man. However, they did create an exception for crimes committed in the imperial ice house during summer. The season courts remind us that justice isn't just about what was done, but about understanding the full context of human behavior, even if that context includes checking what phase the moon was in when someone stole a peach. Part 8. The Tea Court. Have you ever heard of a court where justice was served in a teacup? Welcome to the Tea Court, where imperial crimes were judged through the most elaborate tea ceremony in history. During the Song Dynasty, a unique form of justice emerged combining two of China's most revered traditions: tea ceremonies and legal proceedings. The tea court operated on a simple principle: the manner in which an accused royal family member prepared and served tea revealed their true character and guilt. The most famous case was the Dragon Well incident of 1127. Prince Lifeng was accused of attempting to poison the emperor using tainted dragon well tea. The twist? He had to defend himself while performing a perfect tea ceremony. The tea court chamber was designed like a traditional tea house, but with legal significance attached to every element. The height at which the accused poured the tea, the angle of their wrist, even the pattern of ripples in the cup, all were considered evidence. Expert tea masters served as judges, while court poisoners acted as specialist witnesses. They developed the 7 signs of suspicious steeping, a forensic framework for detecting murderous intent in tea preparation. The accused had to prepare and serve tea to the judges while answering questions. Any trembling hands, spilled drops, or improper technique were seen as signs of guilt. They called this the revelation through refinement principle. During Prince Li's trial, he had to prepare dragon well tea exactly as he had for the emperor. The court's tea masters noted that he cooled the water to exactly 85 degrees, the perfect temperature for dragon well tea. This precision was actually used against him, as it showed he had extensive knowledge of tea preparation. But here's the brilliant twist. Prince Li proved his innocence by deliberately making one small mistake in the ceremony, using spring water instead of winter water. He argued that a true tea poisoner would never risk compromising the taste with the wrong water, as it would make the poison detectable. This defense created the imperfection doctrine, the legal principle that small mistakes could actually prove innocence, as a guilty person would strive for suspicious perfection. The tea courts spawned unique punishments too. Minor offenders were sentenced to serve tea to commoners in public tea houses. More serious criminals had to spend years studying under tea masters in remote mountain temples. One particularly innovative punishment was the tea house exile, where convicted royals had to run a tea house incognito, serving perfect tea while learning humility. Court records show several princes actually became renowned tea masters during their punishment. The tea court wasn't just about justice, it was about finding truth through tradition, revealing character through ceremony, and sometimes discovering wisdom in a perfectly steeped cup of dragon well tea. Part 9. The Dream Court. What if your dreams could put you on trial? In Tang Dynasty China, they actually could. The Dream Court was established in 754 CE under Emperor Xuanzong, after he dreamed of assassinating his favorite concubine. Troubled by his dream self's actions, he created a legal framework for trying crimes committed in the imperial dreamscape. The court employed professional dream interpreters as judges and Buddhist monks as character witnesses. They developed the 3 levels of dream culpability: conscious desire, subconscious intention, and spiritual pollution. The most famous case was that of Emperor Gaozong, known as the Nightmare Emperor. He dreamed of burning the imperial library and was put on trial by his own court. The fascinating part? He was simultaneously prosecutor, defendant, and primary witness. Dream evidence was collected through a complex system. The accused had to record their dreams in special red journals immediately upon waking. Court dream catchers, yes, that was an actual imperial position, would analyze the dreams for criminal intent. The punishments were equally fascinating. You couldn't exactly imprison someone for a dream crime, so they developed spiritual penalties. These included mandatory meditation, dream cleansing rituals, and in severe cases, sleeping on a special punishment bed made of uncomfortable philosophical texts. Emperor Gaozong's trial introduced the concept of dream precedent, the idea that actions in dreams could predict and prevent real crimes. His punishment? He had to spend 1 hour each day in the library he had dream burned, reading to children. The Dream Court created the position of night judge, officials who would be awakened in the middle of the night to hear emergency cases of particularly troubling royal nightmares. They were paid extra for interrupted sleep and had the unique right to appear in court wearing pajamas. Cases got increasingly complex. One prince was tried for dreaming about committing a crime. The court spent 6 months determining jurisdiction between the real Dream Court and the Dream Court. The Dream Court might seem ridiculous to us today, but it represented something profound, the idea that even our unconscious selves should be held accountable for their actions. Part 10. The Music Court. What's the sound of justice? In the Tang Dynasty, it was played on a guqin. The Music Court emerged in 685 CE when Emperor Ruizong declared that true justice could only be found through harmony. This wasn't metaphorical. Defendants literally had to prove their innocence through musical performance. Each trial began with the accused performing the song of righteous intent on their chosen instrument. Court musicians analyzed every note for signs of guilt. They believed that a guilty person couldn't produce truly harmonious music. The most remarkable case was the discord trial of Prince Jean. Accused of plotting against the throne, he had to perform a 3-hour concert on the guqin. The judges noticed he played every happy note in a minor key, a sign of hidden malice. But Prince Jin's defender, a brilliant music theorist, argued that playing happy notes sadly showed deep empathy, not guilt. This created the emotional resonance defense, still studied in Chinese legal history. The court developed complex musical tests. The three harmonies examination required defendants to improvise a piece expressing regret, joy, and wisdom simultaneously. Most failed spectacularly. Punishments were musically themed. Minor offenders had to play funeral dirges at dawn. Serious criminals faced the cacophony, listening to deliberately out-of-tune instruments for hours. The court employed melody detectives who could detect lies through subtle changes in rhythm. They created the 8 signs of deceptive music, including rushed tempo in tragic passages and excessive flourish in simple phrases. But the system wasn't just about punishment. The redemption recital allowed convicted criminals to reduce their sentences through improved musical performances. Many emerged as accomplished musicians. Perhaps the music court's greatest legacy was proving that justice, like music, requires perfect harmony between strictness and mercy, between rule and interpretation, between punishment and redemption. Part 11. The Celestial Court. When stars align, justice follows. The Celestial Court of the Song Dynasty judged imperial crimes based on astronomical signs and heavenly omens. Established in 1082 CE, this unique tribunal operated in an observatory courthouse. Court astronomers served as judges, using star charts and planetary alignments to determine guilt and appropriate punishments. The most famous case was the Venus trial of 1094. Emperor Zhazong was accused of making important decisions during Venus retrograde, considered a serious violation of celestial law. The trial could only proceed when Venus returned to direct motion. Court astrologers developed the 5-planet protocol. Different crimes fell under different planetary jurisdictions. Mars governed violent crimes, Mercury handled fraud, Jupiter oversaw corruption, Saturn dealt with treason, and Venus managed moral offenses. The Comet Clause stated that no verdicts could be issued while a comet was visible in the sky, as it was considered a sign of heavenly disapproval. Some clever defendants would claim to have spotted comets to delay their trials. Punishments were astronomically aligned. Minor offenders might be sentenced to night vigils counting stars. Major criminals faced solar exposure, standing in the noon sun while reciting astronomical calculations. One ingenious prince, charged with corruption, argued that since Jupiter, the justice planet, was in his birth sign, he was cosmically immune from prosecution. This led to the zodiacal defense prohibition, banning astrological loopholes. The court created celestial evidence officers who maintained detailed star maps recording the position of every celestial body during every imperial crime. Their records became the world's first astronomical crime database. The Celestial Court reminds us that justice sometimes requires looking beyond earthly evidence to find higher truths, even if those truths are written in the stars. Part 12. The Garden Court. Justice blooms in unexpected places. In Ming Dynasty China, the Garden Court judged imperial crimes through the language of flowers and the art of landscaping. Established in 1426, this court operated in the imperial gardens, where defendants had to create gardens reflecting their innocence or guilt. Court gardeners served as judges, reading moral messages in plant choices and arrangements. The most intriguing case was the Peony Rebellion of 1448. Prince Zhu Yongxiang, accused of plotting against the throne, created a garden where red peonies, symbolizing power, bowed before white lilies, representing imperial authority. This symbolic submission reduced his sentence from execution to exile. Garden evidence officers developed the 5 elements of floral testament: plant selection, arrangement, seasonal timing, color harmony, and growth direction. A plant growing crooked could indicate a crooked heart. The court established strict rules about criminal botanicals. Poisonous plants were forbidden, as were thorny ones near path, seen as signs of hostile intent. The placement of rocks could represent stubborn resistance or steady loyalty. Punishments were garden-themed. Minor offenders maintained palace flower beds. Serious criminals faced the withering, watching their carefully cultivated gardens die while reciting the meanings of each plant. The most powerful defense was the growing remorse strategy. Defendants would plant seeds at the trial's start, arguing that their guilt should be judged when the plants matured. This led to the seasonal justice principle. Some trials lasted full growing seasons. Garden court architects created truth paths, garden walkways where every turn represented a moral choice. Defendants had to explain their path choices, revealing their character through their journey through the garden. The garden court proved that justice, like a garden, requires patience, careful tending, and the wisdom to know which seeds to nurture and which weeds to remove. Part 13, the Poetry Court, Final Chapter. In the final years of imperial China, justice was served in verse. The Poetry Court, established in 1644, was the last and perhaps most sophisticated of all imperial courts. Here, crimes were tried through the art of poetry, where every word could mean life or death. Cases began with the opening verse, where defendants had to compose a poem explaining their actions. Court poets analyzed every metaphor, every rhythm, every subtle allusion for signs of guilt or innocence. The most renowned case was the Chrysanthemum Conspiracy of 1645. Prince Wu, accused of sedition, defended himself with a complex poem about chrysanthemums blooming in winter. The surface meaning suggested loyalty, but hidden references to frost-resistant petals implied resistance to imperial power. Court analysts developed the 7 levels of poetic truth: literal meaning, metaphorical intent, historical reference, tonal implication, structural significance, rhythmic confession, and spiritual resonance. A guilty person, they believed, couldn't maintain consistency across all 7 levels. The verse verdict system required judges to deliver sentences in matching poetic form. If the accused used a Tang-style quatrain, the verdict had to follow the same structure. This led to some of the most beautiful legal documents in history. Punishments were literary. Minor offenses meant copying classical poems 1,000 times. Serious crimes required composing contrition verses while balancing on one foot. The most severe punishment? Being forced to write bad poetry deliberately. The court's most innovative feature was the echo defense. Defendants could respond to accusations only in verse forms that echoed their alleged crimes. A rushed crime required rushed meter. A premeditated offense demanded careful composition. One clever princess, accused of extravagance, defended herself with a poem so sparse it used only 4 characters. This created the minimalist precedent, the idea that poetic restraint could prove moral restraint. The Poetry Court represents the pinnacle of imperial justice, where law and art merged, where truth was found not just in facts, but in the spaces between words, in the rhythm of justice, in the poetry of human nature. And so ends our journey through the most fascinating court systems in imperial history. From magical mirrors to poetic justice, from dream crimes to musical verdicts, we've journeyed through one of history's most fascinating legal systems. A system where justice wasn't just served, but performed, cultivated, and sometimes even sung. These courts remind us that justice can take unexpected forms. Sometimes it's found in a perfectly brewed cup of tea, sometimes in the arrangement of garden flowers, and sometimes in a parrot's testimony. You know, they say the ghost of the jade parrot still haunts the Forbidden City, occasionally mimicking imperial commands just to confuse the tourists. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into imperial China's extraordinary justice system, don't let your journey through history end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts. Also, don't forget to hit that notification bell to join us on our next historical adventure. Every week, we uncover more fascinating stories that time forgot, from ancient conspiracies to medieval memes, from royal scandals to revolutionary pranks. And remember, as they used to say in the tea court, justice, like the perfect cup of tea, requires patience, precision, and sometimes a pinch of madness. Until next time, stay curious.